My son-in-law Preston laughed at my quilt collection for years. But the evening he called my late husband's handmade rocking chair a fire hazard that should have been thrown out decades ago, in front of my grandchildren, in my own living room, something inside me quietly broke. I had smiled through years of his comments. I had laughed along because it felt easier than the alternative. But that night, standing in my own hallway, holding a mug of tea I no longer wanted, I made a decision so quietly it didn't even feel like a decision yet. My daughter, Wren Calloway, and her husband, Preston Calloway, would not be invited to Christmas this year. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I finally understood something I should have understood years ago. Some people take warmth as an invitation to keep taking. My name is June Alderton. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in the same two-story house in Guelph, Ontario for 31 years. The house sits on a corner lot with a silver maple out front that my late husband, Edmund Alderton, planted himself the spring we moved in. He said maples were the most Canadian thing he could think of, and he wanted the house to belong here. That was Edmund, always trying to put roots somewhere. Edmund passed away 6 years ago from a heart attack he never saw coming. Neither did I. One Tuesday in November, he kissed me goodbye on his way to the hardware store and never came back. The paramedics said it was fast. I've always tried to hold on to that on the hard nights. We raised 2 children in this house. Our son, Calvin, lives in Halifax now with his partner and their daughter, a loud and joyful little girl named Bea, who calls me Nan June and insists on video calls every Sunday. And then there's Wren, my oldest, Wren Calloway, 41, who married Preston Calloway 8 years ago in a ceremony at a winery outside Niagara-on-the-Lake. I wore a lavender dress Edmund called the color of a good evening, and I cried through most of the ceremony because she was so happy. She looked so happy. Preston worked in commercial real estate. Still does. He wore the kind of confidence that looks like charm until you've known someone long enough to see the seams. When Wren first brought him home, he shook my hand firmly, complimented the house, and called Edmund's woodworking rustic in a very genuine way. I told Edmund afterward that something about that compliment felt a little off. Edmund said I was overthinking it. He was probably right. He was often right about people being better than I expected, and I was often right about things not sitting quite straight. The first comment was so small I barely remembered it. We were sitting at the dining room table for Wren and Preston's first Thanksgiving at our house, and Preston glanced at the quilt draped over Edmund's chair in the corner, the one I'd made 20 years ago from squares of the kids' old clothing, and said, mildly, very homemade. He smiled after saying it. Wren gave a quick little laugh. Edmund said, it is. June made it, and moved on, and so did I. But that's the thing about small things, they don't stay small. They keep company with each other until one day you look up and realize the room is full of them. Over the next few years, Preston's comments arrived steadily, always dressed up as observation or humor. He called my hooked rugs very provincial. He described Edmund's homemade rocking chair as a character piece. When I served butter tarts, Edmund's favorite, the recipe from his mother's handwritten index card, Preston picked one up, turned it over like he was examining it for damage, and said, "These are so old-fashioned, Mum June." He started calling me Mum June around year 3. I never asked him to, and Wren laughed. She almost always laughed. Not cruelly, not with any edge I could name, but with the easy laugh of someone who had learned that agreeing was simpler than defending something that felt, I think, embarrassing to her. That was the hardest part to admit to myself. My daughter had become embarrassed by me. It had happened slowly, the way most painful things do. When Wren was young, she used to sit beside me at the quilting frame for hours, threading needles, and asking questions about everything, about the fabric, about the patterns, about which pieces came from which of her old dresses. She used to run her fingers along Edmund's woodwork and say it felt like something that would last forever. She told her teacher in grade 3 that her mum was an artist. She was 9 years old when she said that, and I kept the note the teacher sent home about it for years. But somewhere between that 9-year-old and the woman who married Preston Calloway, something shifted. The things that once made her feel proud began to make her feel like she needed to explain them, to apologize for them, and eventually, to let someone else make jokes about them before anyone else could. After Edmund died, I leaned into the quilting even more. It gave my hands something to do when the evenings got too long and the quiet got too heavy. I joined the Guelph Heritage Quilters group that met on Thursday mornings at St. James Hall, a group of women I had known for years, most of them around my age or older, all of us carrying something we didn't always talk about directly. We talked about fabric instead, about color and weight, and how different patterns behave at the corners. Every December, the group organized a small community show. The Warmth Show, they called it, because one of our members, Harriet, had started it 20 years earlier with the idea that quilts were essentially wearable warmth, and people should be reminded of that. We displayed our work, offered pieces for donation, served squares and coffee, and invited the public to come through. Edmund had come every year he was alive. He would stand in front of whichever quilt I'd submitted that year, and say the same thing every time. "That one's my favorite." I used to tell him he said that about all of them. He said he meant it every time. I still entered work every year after he died. It felt important to keep going. It felt like a way of not letting the things we'd built together dissolve into nothing. Preston came to the show once, the year after we were married. He walked through in about 15 minutes and said on the way out, "Very impressive for a hobby." He never came again. Wren stopped coming the following year. She was busy, she said, and I believed her the first time. The Christmas that changed everything started, as most breaking points do, with something very ordinary. Wren and Preston arrived on December 23rd with their 2 children, Margot and Sam, who were 8 and 5 and wonderful in the complicated way children are when they haven't yet decided who they're supposed to be. They tumbled through the front door in a tangle of winter coats, and it was immediately warmer in the house, the way it always is when children are present. I had spent 4 days preparing. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine. I'd made a tray of shortbread in Edmund's old tin, the one with the Christmas scene on the lid that had been dented in the same place since 1994. The dining room table was set with the good dishes Edmund and I had bought together on a trip to Quebec City for our 25th anniversary. The centerpiece was a table runner I'd made from green and cream fabric printed with tiny spruce trees. It had taken me 3 weeks. Preston walked in, unbuttoned his coat, handed it to Wren without looking at her, and surveyed the living room the way someone surveys a property they're considering not purchasing. His eyes landed on Edmund's rocking chair by the window. "Still keeping that old thing, Mum June?" Margot immediately climbed into the rocking chair and started rocking enthusiastically. "I love Grandpa's chair," she announced. "I know you do, sweetheart," I said. Preston glanced at the chair again. "It's a liability, honestly. Edmund make that himself." "He did?" "Yeah." He made a small sound in his throat, something between amusement and dismissal. "You'd never get that past a home inspector." Wren set bags down in the hallway. "Preston, she's not selling the house. I'm just saying, structurally." I offered him tea. I always offered him tea because it gave me something to do with my hands when I needed to not respond to something. Dinner on the 23rd was fine. Better than fine, actually. The children were delightful. Calvin called from Halifax, and we passed the phone around and laughed at Bea trying to sing a Christmas song she'd only heard twice. Wren was relaxed and kind and laughed at things I said, and it felt, briefly, like things might be all right. Then Preston finished his 3rd glass of wine and looked at my table runner. "Did you make this too?" "I did." He tilted his head. "It's very craft fair." He glanced at Wren. "We should get you a proper one. Restoration Hardware does gorgeous table linens." Wren said nothing. She looked at her wineglass. "I like it," Margot said clearly from the end of the table. "It has trees." "It does," I said. "Your grandfather picked the fabric with me." Preston smiled at his daughter. "That's sweet, Bug." Then to me, "Really though, Mum June, you could let yourself have nicer things. You've earned it." I smiled. I said something like, "I have everything I need." I changed the subject. I did what I always did. But something about the way he said, "You've earned it," stayed with me all night. As if my home were a phase I should have graduated out of. As if Edmund's chair, and my quilts, and my scratched-up Quebec City dishes were signs of a life not yet improved. I lay awake that night listening to the house breathe, and I thought about Edmund's voice. About how he used to walk through this same house and see it exactly as it was, worn in places, full of color, built up year by year from things that mattered. And say, "This is a good house, June. This is a home." Preston had never once said anything like that. The next morning was Christmas Eve. I was in the kitchen at 6:30 making coffee when Wren came downstairs early and found me standing at the counter looking out at the backyard. "You okay?" she asked. "Fine," I said. "Just early." She poured herself a cup and stood beside me. For a few minutes we didn't say anything. It was nice, actually. Quiet in the way that only happens when the children are still asleep. Then she said carefully, "Preston doesn't mean anything by the comments, you know." I looked at her. He's very focused on the visual side of things. For work. It carries over. He called Dad's rocking chair a liability. Wren wrapped both hands around her mug. "He says things like that. It's not personal." Something inside me settled, very quietly, in the direction of no. Not in a dramatic way. Not with any words attached to it yet. Just a small, still movement, like a compass needle finding north. "All right," I said. She seemed relieved. "Good. He doesn't mean anything." I gave her a smile I didn't entirely feel and went back to making coffee. Christmas morning was beautiful in the way. Mornings with grandchildren always are. Chaotic and loud and bright. Wrapping paper everywhere, Sam sitting in a pile of ribbon looking stunned, Margot reading out the tags on every present with the seriousness of a barrister. I made French toast with the challah I'd braided the day before, and Edmund's cast-iron griddle that I'd had since before the children were born. It filled the kitchen with the smell of vanilla and brown sugar. Preston ate 2 pieces and said, "Not bad, little dense though." Margot ate 3 pieces and said, "Nan, June, this is the best thing I've ever had." Children are honest in ways that cost them nothing, because they don't yet know what things are supposed to cost. We moved into the living room after breakfast. The children played. Preston sat in an armchair with his phone. Wren helped me clear the kitchen. And then at some point in the early afternoon, Preston stood up and wandered toward Edmund's rocking chair, the way he had been orbiting it all weekend. He sat in it, rocked it twice, looked down at the joints where Edmund had fitted the spindles. "How old is this thing?" "Edmund made it the year Wren was born." 41 years. He shook his head slightly. "You know, I have a client who does estate clearances. He could tell you exactly what something like this is worth. For the wood alone." The room was quiet for a second. Sam looked up from the floor. "Is someone selling Grandpa's chair?" "No," I said. "Nobody's selling anything," Wren said at the same time. Preston raised his hands. "I'm just saying it's an asset. You've got equity everywhere in this house that's just sitting here being sentimental." He said the word sentimental the way some people say unnecessary. I set down the dish towel I was holding. Not dramatically. Not with any noise. I just set it down on the arm of the sofa and looked at Preston for a moment and said, very evenly, "I'd like some fresh air, excuse me." I put on my coat and stood on the front porch in the December cold for about 10 minutes. The maple Edmund planted was bare and gray against the winter sky. I stood there until I could breathe properly again. When I came back inside, I didn't say anything about it. I made tea. I played cards with the grandchildren. I got through the evening. But that night, after everyone was asleep, I sat at my quilting table in the spare room. The room that still had a bit of Edmund's smell in it, cedar and linseed oil, and I thought very clearly for a very long time. I thought about the word sentimental. I thought about Wren's face, when I said Dad's chair had been called a liability. I thought about every Christmas Eve I'd prepared for, every dish I'd made, every quilt draped over every chair, every effort I had made to fill this house with warmth for people who came and went and left it a little colder each time. I thought about Edmund's voice saying, "This is a home," and I made a decision that felt, in that quiet room, like the only honest thing left to do. Wren called me in the first week of January. She'd gone back to Toronto. The children were back in school. Life had returned to whatever speed it ran at for them. "We were thinking Easter at ours this year," she said. "Preston wants to host." I was folding laundry when she called. I kept folding. "I appreciate that," I said, "but I'll probably do something small here." A pause. "Small meaning what?" "Calvin might come down from Halifax, or we'll do a call. Something low-key. We could all be there. I'll be in touch closer to the date." Another pause, this one longer. "Mum, is something wrong?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without turning a phone call into something neither of us was prepared for. "I just need a quiet spring," I said. "That's all." She said she understood. I don't think she did, but she let it go. I spent January and most of February the way I always spend winter in Guelph, quietly, comfortably, at my own pace. I quilted. I went to Thursday morning group. I walked when the roads weren't too icy. I cooked for myself, and Calvin called on Sundays, and Bea showed me things she'd made at school through the phone camera, demanding I confirm they were beautiful, which they always were. There was a freedom to January that I hadn't expected. I kept waiting for the guilt to arrive. It mostly didn't. What arrived instead was something lighter. Like a window cracked open after a long winter with all the vents sealed. My friend Vivian Marsh. I'd known Vivian since before Edmund died. We'd met through the quilters group years ago. Noticed it at our February meeting. "You seem better," she said, direct as she always was. "Like you've put something down, I suppose." "I have." "Good," Vivian said. "Some things are too heavy to keep carrying." She didn't ask what it was. That's the thing about old friends. They know when the answer doesn't need to be said out loud. March came, and I got a call I wasn't expecting. Harriet, who ran the Warmth show, asked if I would be willing to let the local paper run a small feature about my work ahead of the spring charity auction the quilters were organizing. A woman named Sandra Okafor from the Guelph Tribune had apparently come to the winter show, seen my large panel piece, a year's work, blues and golds and deep red, named November for the month Edmund died, and wanted to write about it. I said yes mostly because Harriet asked me, and I never say no to Harriet. Sandra Okafor arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, a tall woman in her 40s with a voice recorder and a notebook, and the particular kind of attentiveness that makes you feel like what you're saying matters even when you're not sure it does. We sat at my dining table, the one with the table runner, with the spruce trees, and she asked me about the work. I told her about the quilting, about Edmund, about how the craft felt like a way of keeping track of time, of preserving things that would otherwise disappear, about my grandmother's quilt that I still had in a cedar chest upstairs, the oldest thing in my possession, made from feed sacks in a farmhouse in Nova Scotia before I was born. Sandra asked if she could photograph the November piece. I hung it in the living room, against the wall where the light was good, and she spent a long time looking at it before she took a single picture. "This is extraordinary," she said. It wasn't flattery. She said it the way you say something when you're simply reporting what you see. The article ran the following week. Small, inside the community section. A photograph of the November piece. A photograph of me at my quilting frame, which I hadn't known she'd taken. A few paragraphs about the work, the group, the auction. She had quoted me saying that quilts are how I remember things that matter. I didn't think much of it. I shared it with Calvin, who called immediately and was extremely enthusiastic in the way only people who love you without any agenda ever are. Vivian texted a line of hearts. Thursday morning at the quilters group, Harriet put the article on the bulletin board, and then Wren texted. "Saw the piece in the Tribune. Looks like things are going well for you." Something about the phrasing, "looks like things are going well for you," sat in my chest at an odd angle. Not congratulations. Not pride. More like an observation made from a distance. I wrote back, "Thank you for reading it," and I left it there. 2 days later, I got a longer message from her. She wrote that she'd been thinking about the Christmas visit. She wrote that she felt I had been distant since then, and she wasn't sure what she'd done wrong. She wrote that Preston was a direct person, but he didn't intend to be hurtful, and she wished I would try to understand his communication style. She wrote that she felt like I was punishing her for her husband's personality. I read it 3 times. Then I put the phone face down on the table and went to make tea, because sometimes you need a few minutes before you can respond to something clearly. When I came back, I wrote, "I love you very much, Wren, but there are some things I'd like to talk about in person, not by text. Can we find a time?" She said yes. We arranged a date in April. In the meantime, the Tribune article got picked up by a regional arts newsletter, and then a quilting association in Waterloo shared it on their page, and then someone posted it in a heritage crafts group online, and it circulated further than any of us expected. The Warmth show auction, when it happened, sold every piece. Mine went to a retired nurse from Cambridge who stood in front of it for a long time and said it reminded her of her mother. I thought about that for days afterward. A quilt I made in a quiet room, grieving, in the dark months after Edmund died. And a stranger saw her mother in it. That's what Edmund used to say about good work. He said good work finds the people who need it. I didn't tell Wren about the auction. I didn't tell her the piece had sold. I wasn't keeping it from her. I just realized I no longer felt the need to offer her my life as evidence. We met in April, on a Saturday, at a café near her office in Toronto, where she sometimes went on weekends. It was neutral ground, which we both seemed to understand was what was needed. She looked tired, not unkindly tired, just the tired that comes from carrying something you haven't put down yet. "I've missed you," she said. "I've missed you too," I said. I meant it. We ordered, and then for a while we talked about the children, about Calvin, about small, safe things. Then she set down her cup and looked at me carefully. "Was it the chair?" she asked. "The comment about Dad's chair." "It was many things," I said. She nodded slowly. "I know he goes too far sometimes. He called your father's work a liability. He said it in front of your children, in my home on Christmas." Wren looked at the table. "He doesn't think before he speaks. I know that," I said. "I've known that for years. But I've spent years absorbing it. And I realized I don't want to keep doing that." A silence. "He means well," she said. And I heard how thin that had gotten. How many times she'd said it, maybe even to herself, until it no longer quite worked. "Wren." I waited until she looked up. "I'm not asking you to leave him. I'm not asking you to choose sides. I'm just telling you that I can't keep hosting evenings where I spend the whole time waiting for the next thing he's going to say about my home, or my work, or your father's things. It's exhausting, and it isn't something I want to arrange my Christmases around anymore." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I didn't know it was that bad." "I know," I said, "because I kept smoothing it over. That's on me too." Something shifted in her face then, not relief exactly, but something that looked like a door opening a little. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "I thought about that honestly." "Because you were happy," I said, "and I didn't want to be the thing that complicated your happiness." Wren looked at the table again. Then, "He said things about Dad." "Yes!" And I laughed. Her voice was very small when she said that. "You didn't know what else to do," I said. "I understand that." She pressed her fingers against her eyes briefly. "He's not going to change easily, I know. But I could." She stopped. I could stop laughing. When he does it, I could say something. That was more than I had expected from that afternoon. More than I had allowed myself to hope for, honestly. "That would mean something to me," I said. We sat there for a while after that, not saying very much, just sitting in the same space the way families do when they're working out what the new shape of something is going to be. On the drive back to Guelph, I stopped at a garden center outside Acton, because the forsythia in the parking lot was in bloom, that specific yellow that only happens for about 2 weeks in April, and Edmund loved forsythia. He called it unreasonably cheerful. I bought a small pot and put it on the porch railing when I got home, next to the door, where I'd see it every morning. Calvin called that Sunday. I told him about the café meeting with Wren. He was quiet for a moment and then said very simply, "Good, Mum. I'm glad you said it." I told him about the forsythia too, and he said, "Dad would have put 12 of them in the front yard and called it tasteful." I laughed until my eyes watered. Wren didn't call for about 2 weeks after our café meeting. I didn't reach out either. We both needed the space to figure out what the conversation had been the beginning of. Then she called on a Thursday evening while I was at the quilting table. "Margot wants to come see your quilts," she said. "The ones you have in the spare room. She's been asking." I set down my needle. "She's welcome any time. Maybe a weekend in May?" A pause. Just the three of us. I'd leave Preston home. I took that in, not as a victory, not as a defeat for anyone. Just as a thing she had decided in whatever way she had worked it through. "That would be lovely," I said. The weekend Wren and Margot came in May was a Saturday with the kind of soft spring light that makes everything in Ontario look like it was painted by someone who was trying very hard. Margot went straight to the spare room and stood in front of every quilt in turn with an 8-year-old's complete seriousness. "This one is about Grandpa Edmund," I told her, pointing to a piece I'd made the first winter after he died. dark blues and one square of his old flannel shirt in the corner. Margot looked at it for a long time. "Do you miss him?" "Every day." She nodded like that made sense. "Me too. I only met him a few times, but he let me help him in the workshop." I had forgotten that. She'd been 3 the last time he saw her. I hadn't known she remembered. "He liked you very much," I said. She seemed satisfied by that. Wren made herself useful in the kitchen, while I showed Margot how a quilt frame works. How you stretch and pin the layers. How the stitches have to be even or the whole thing puckers. Margot asked if she could try. She sat at the frame with the thimble too big for her finger and made 4 very uneven stitches and declared it perfect. We had dinner at the dining table with the spruce tree runner. I made roast chicken and the scalloped potatoes that had been my mother's recipe. Marga ate almost everything on her plate and asked for seconds of the potatoes, and said, without preamble, "These taste like Christmas but better." Wren caught my eye across the table and smiled. A real one. The kind I recognized from before things had gotten complicated. After dinner, Margot fell asleep on the sofa under one of my quilts with the television on low. And Wren and I sat at the kitchen table with tea and talked for almost 2 hours. About Edmund. About what she remembered of growing up in this house. About how she had felt, without quite having the words for it when it was happening, ashamed of things that she now couldn't explain why. "I think I wanted Preston to approve of where I came from," she said. "And when he didn't, it felt easier to agree with him." "I know," I said. "That's not an excuse." "No. But it's an explanation. There's a difference." She turned her mug in her hands. I've been asking him to notice when he goes too far. He doesn't always. But I say something now. "That matters," I said. "I'm sorry it took so long." I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table, in the same kitchen where she had learned to crack eggs and roll pastry and tell me things she didn't tell anyone else, and I thought about all the ways love persists even when it gets complicated. How it doesn't stop. It just goes quiet for a while, waiting to find a way back through. "We're finding our way," I said. "That's enough." She nodded. Her eyes were bright in a way that told me she was close to crying. She inherited that from Edmund. The eyes going bright before anything else gave way. We didn't fix everything that evening. I won't pretend we did. Preston didn't come with them, and his presence in our family is something that will require ongoing navigation, not a single resolved evening. There are things that don't mend cleanly, but when Wren and Margot left the next morning, Margot hugged me at the door with her whole body, the way children do, and said, "Nan June, can I come back when it's not a special occasion? Just to see the quilts?" "You can come any time," I said. "The quilts will be here." She nodded seriously. "And Grandpa's chair?" "And Grandpa's chair," I said. "Always." She ran back to the car. Wren stood at the door a moment longer. "I'll call," she said. "I know," I said, and I believed her this time. The maple in the front yard was in full leaf now, green and wide, casting the kind of shade Edmund always said was the best thing a tree could do. I stood on the porch after they drove away and looked at it for a while. The forsythia had finished its 2 weeks of unreasonable cheerfulness. The maple would stay. I went back inside, put the kettle on, and sat at my quilting table. Outside, Guelph was doing its ordinary Saturday morning things. Dogs being walked, someone mowing an early lawn, a delivery truck turning at the corner. Inside, the house was quiet and mine and full of everything that mattered. I picked up my needle and kept working.